Forget everything you've seen in the movies. Forget the shiny, polished armor, the heroic speeches given on a sun-drenched hill, and the clean, honorable deaths. In reality, a medieval battlefield didn't smell like glory. It smelled like rotting meat, open sewers, and wet, filthy wool. It wasn't a place where heroes were made. It was a place where ordinary people were broken in ways we can barely imagine today. If you think you know what medieval warfare was like because you've seen a Hollywood blockbuster, you're about to realize that the truth is much, much darker. Most people imagine the Middle Ages as a time of knights in shining armor, but for the average person living through it, war was a survival horror game that never seemed to end. It wasn't just about two armies meeting in a field for an hour. It was a grinding, miserable machine that destroyed everything it touched, from the soil in the ground to the souls of the men holding the swords. Let's start with the first thing most people get wrong: how you even ended up in a war. Imagine you're a farmer named Thomas. It's the year 1346. You don't care about who sits on the throne in a city you've never seen. You care about your wheat crop and your family. But in the medieval world, you don't own your life. Your lord does. When the king decides he wants a piece of land in France, he calls his barons. The barons call the knights, and the knights come to your village and tell you that you're now a soldier. You aren't given a uniform. You aren't given a rifle. You grab a reinforced jacket made of scrap linen, a rusty billhook you usually use to trim hedges, and you start walking. You aren't fighting for a country. You're fighting because if you don't, your family loses their home. This was the Feudal Levy, a system where war was essentially a tax paid in blood. But as you start the long march toward the coast, you notice something. There is a massive divide between the haves and the have-nots. Over there, sitting on a massive horse that costs more than your entire village, is a knight. His armor is a masterpiece of engineering. It's custom-fitted, gleaming, and designed to make him nearly invincible to someone like you. Think of a knight like a modern main battle tank. He is the elite, the 1% of the 1%. He has spent his entire life from the age of 7 training for this moment. While you were learning to plow fields, he was learning how to kill. Now you might think the biggest threat to your life would be that knight's sword, but you'd be wrong. The most dangerous enemy in medieval warfare wasn't a person, it was a microscopic killer. As Thomas and thousands of other men march, they have to eat and sleep. There are no portable toilets. There is no refrigerated food. Thousands of men and horses are packed into tight camps. Within days, the water sources are contaminated. This led to the bloody flux, what we now call dysentery. It was a nightmare. More soldiers died from dehydration and internal sickness in the mud of their own camps than were ever killed by an arrow. Imagine being a mighty warrior and spending your final days unable to even stand up, wasting away in a damp tent. This was the silent killer that decided more wars than any general ever did. But what if you survived the sickness? Then came the most common form of fighting, the siege. In the movies, sieges are full of giant fireball catapults and heroic wall climbing. In reality, a siege was a slow, agonizing game of who starves first. An army would surround a castle and simply wait. Inside, the defenders would eventually run out of grain. Then they'd eat the horses. Then the dogs. Then the cats. There are records of people boiling the leather of their own boots just to have something to chew on. And if the attackers got bored, they'd use biological warfare. They would take the bodies of horses that had died of disease and use a trebuchet to fling them over the castle walls. The goal wasn't to hit anyone. It was to let the rotting corpse sit in the sun, spread plague, and ruin the water supply. It was psychological and biological horror on a massive scale. If the walls were too strong, they'd dig. Sappers would tunnel under the foundations, prop the tunnel up with wooden beams, and then set the wood on fire. The tunnel would collapse, and the massive stone towers above would simply sink into the earth like a sandcastle. Now, let's talk about the climax, the rare moment where two armies actually met in an open field. Let's look at a moment that changed everything, the Battle of Agincourt. This is a key turning point in history because it proved that the invincible knight could be defeated by a peasant with a piece of wood. The English were outnumbered, starving and sick with the flux. The French were the elite, the pride of European knighthood. As the French knights charged, they thought it would be a massacre, but the ground was a nightmare. It had rained for days, turning the field into a deep clay-like soup. As the knights in their heavy plate armor tried to charge, Their horses sank to their knees. That's when the English longbowmen stepped up. These weren't just guys with bows. These were men who had practiced every day since childhood. Their skeletons actually grew deformed from the sheer tension of pulling those bows. They unleashed a storm of arrows, thousands every few seconds. But here's the shocking fact: the arrows didn't usually pierce the knight's armor. Instead, they killed the horses. Imagine being trapped under a 200-pound dying horse in a field of deep mud, while thousands of other men are crashing into you from behind. This created the press. This is the part of medieval warfare that is truly terrifying. It was a human crush. Men were packed so tightly together that they couldn't even lift their arms to fight. Many knights didn't die from sword wounds. They died of asphyxiation. They were pushed down into the mud and literally crushed to death by the weight of the crowd above them. They drowned in the earth because they couldn't get back up. If you were a knight and you were knocked down but not killed, you might think you were lucky. You weren't. See, you were a high-value target. A knight's family would pay a massive ransom to get him back. So if you were a noble, the enemy would try to capture you. But if you were a commoner like Thomas, there was no ransom for a farmer. If you were wounded on the field, the mercy you received was a dagger called a misericord, literally the mercy giver, slipped through the gap in your helmet. And for those who survived the battle but had a wound, that's where the real horror began. Medieval medicine was a mix of brilliant intuition and terrifying guesswork. There were no painkillers. There were no antibiotics. If an arrow was stuck in your leg, the surgeon might use a tool called the Bradmore screw to grip the arrowhead and pull it out. To stop the bleeding, they'd take a piece of iron, heat it until it was glowing white, and press it directly into your open flesh to cauterize it. The smell of burning skin was the smell of healing. If the wound got infected, which it almost always did, they believed that pus was a good sign. They called it laudable pus. They thought your body was venting the badness. In reality, it was the sound of a death sentence. As we look back at the brutal reality, we have to ask, why did they do it? The truth is, for most, there was no choice. The medieval world wasn't a story of heroes and villains. It was a world of systems. A system that demanded blood as tax. A system that valued a horse more than a farmer's life. And a system where mercy was found at the tip of a blade. We look back at the age of chivalry and see the shining armor and the banners waving in the wind. But if you could ask Thomas, standing in the mud at Agincourt, listening to the screams of men being crushed under their own weight, he would tell you a different story. He would tell you that the armor wasn't shining. It was stained, and the glory wasn't in the winning. It was simply in surviving long enough to see home again. We often romanticize the past because we didn't have to live through it. But the next time you see a knight in a movie riding off into a golden sunset, remember the mud. Remember the silence of the camps. And remember that history isn't written in gold. It's written in the dirt.